Next year will mark the 150th anniversary of the publication of the first volume of Capital. Extraordinary. It's an extraordinary work, and what I want to start by saying is that Capital, after 150 years, retains, when you read it, all of its freshness, its vitality, and its relevance to the world today. That's not to say that we don't need to creatively apply Capital. It's not to say that we don't need to update and revitalise the analysis. It's not to say that we don't need to think about the world and all the changes that have happened in the last 150 years. But I think it's very important to say that the subject that Marx is exploring in Capital, his book Capital, is not the capitalism of the Victorian period in which he lived. It's not specific to the historical phase that he's describing. But what he's talking about in Capital is he's trying to give a description of the social relations of the capitalist system in general and the laws of motion of capital, of capitalism that arise from those social relations of the capitalist system. And in my view, Marx largely succeeds in that enormous task that he sets himself. And the success of Marx is all the more striking when you compare it to the abject failure of mainstream economics to come to terms with its own system. I'll give you a little quote. It's one of my favourite quotes that's arisen since the crisis. It's from Willem Buiter, who's a London School of Economics professor and a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, looking at mainstream economics. And he says this: "The typical graduate macroeconomics and monetary economics training received at an Anglo-American university during the past 30 years or so may have set back for decades serious investigation of aggregate economic behaviour and economic policy relevant understanding. It was a privately and socially costly waste of time and other resources." That's how a leading economist views the entirety of mainstream economics over the last 30 years. My job today is to try to persuade you that reading Capital is not a waste of your time and resources, privately or socially. And on the question of resources, copies of Capital are on sale. I have a bet with one of the members of Bookmarks that I can persuade one of you to buy all 3 volumes of Capital. There's £20 resting on it for me, so I'll buy you a drink afterwards if you do. It reminds me of a joke by Karl Marx's mum that if only poor Karl had spent as much time making Capital as writing about it, he wouldn't have been so horrendously poor. Okay. Let me start by explaining why I think it is that Marx in Capital is able to be so successful in this project. You see, the first thing to say is that Marx's writing comes from an engagement with a form of economics much more important, much more deep, much more penetrating than economic theory as we encounter it today. What Marx is doing in his writings is, first of all, engaging with and also criticising economics as it emerges at its high point from the writing of the great classical political economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And if you compare Smith and Ricardo to mainstream economics today, you're talking about a very different beast. If you look at mainstream economics today, it's a mixture of apologetics for the system, attempts to look at very fine movements of prices on markets, very obscure mathematical models. I mean, some people have described economics as really a branch of advanced mathematics today, and so on and so forth. If you look at the political economy of Smith and Ricardo, it's very, very different. Because Smith and Ricardo are grappling with a system that's still emerging, that's still becoming on a global scale the dominant economic system. And because it's emerging in this way, Smith and Ricardo are forced to grapple in different ways with how the system actually functions. They're forced to reveal basic truths of the system and look a little bit more deeply at how the system actually works as a system. That said, Smith and Ricardo remain thinkers who identify with the capitalist system. And it brings me to my second point about Marx, which is that Marx is able to go beyond the classical political economists in part because for Marx, the starting point, the viewpoint, the vantage point is very, very different. Capital is a very explicitly politically motivated work. And throughout the work Capital, Marx identifies with a group that he sees as both exploited by capitalism, but also a group who he sees as the alternative to capitalism, the force in society, the working class who he sees as having the potential to overcome and overthrow capitalism. And it runs right through the book. If you read the opening page of Capital Volume 1, there's a dedication there that Marx makes, and he makes it not to the great philosopher Hegel or Feuerbach, the other people he has enormous admiration for, not for Smith or Ricardo. The dedication of the first volume of Capital is to a guy called Wilhelm Wolff, a leading German socialist, a co-thinker of Marx, someone who fought on the barricades, and so on. He says, it's dedicated to Wolff, intrepid, faithful, noble protagonist of the proletariat. Everything Marx does is infused with this kind of politics. He writes of Capital somewhere that, compared to some of his earlier writings, it will have to be more popular to some degree because it has an expressly revolutionary function. He says somewhere else, Capital is the most tremendous missile hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie. If you're hurling Capital, use the hardback version, the Lawrence Wishart, much heavier. It's the most terrible missile hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie. When it's published in French, it's serialised in a newspaper, and he says this, it says, in this form, the book will be more accessible to the working class, a consideration which to me outweighs everything else. It's a missile to be hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie, not by Marx, but by the proletariat. It's a book for working class people, and it's a book that Marx wanted to be accessible to working class people. Now, it was a long, long time coming. Just one other thing about the text itself before I talk about how to read it. Took a very, very long time. Marx begins looking at political economy as early as 1843, 1844. Very early in his political career, he's engaging with political economy. And you sense, if you read Marx's correspondence, this constant pull of Marx in different directions. Every time there's a whiff of economic crisis, he's pulled back into writing about economics. But on the other side, every time there's a whiff of political activity, he's pulled the other way. I feel a little bit like this, having tried to write this meeting during the Lexit campaign and so on. Or constant pull on serious revolutionaries between theoretical work and activism. In 1848, revolutions break out across Europe, and Marx is pulled into revolutionary activity. Slightly less importantly, but in 1860, Marx breaks off from writing Capital to write a book called Herr Vogt, a spy in the German workers' movement. A very, very obscure text, one of the few books that Marx actually finishes writing. He spends months writing this book, and it's about a challenge that he faces in the political movement with someone slandering him in the socialist movement. Herr Vogt is a book that none of you should go away and read. It's only worth reading if you have lots of enemies and you want to know how to insult them in effective and colourful ways. It's a bizarre book. Much more seriously, in 1864, just before Capital comes out, he's pulled away to the meeting of the First International, the foundation of his great workers' organisation. There's a constant pull of Marx into activity. But along with that, Marx is incapable of finishing almost anything he writes. Although he's beautifully unaware of this fact in a lot of his correspondence. So as early as 1851, he writes to his friend Frederick Engels, "I'm so advanced that in 5 weeks, I'll be through with all the whole economic shit, and then I'll look at something else." 1851, he says that. 16 years later, the first volume of Capital appears. 16 years after that, Marx dies, leaving behind these massive manuscripts that poor Engels has to then turn into the second and third volumes. He never finishes writing this work. Okay, so how to read it? The Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson very famously said, "I only got as far as page 2. That's where there's a footnote that's almost a page long." Now, that tells you two things. It tells you, first of all, the paucity of theory inside the British Labour Party, but it also tells you that the first chapter of Capital is in some ways the most difficult. It's a very, very challenging read. And I want to say quite a lot about the first chapter of Capital. Because what Marx is dealing with in the first chapter is intrinsically quite hard, because he's dealing with a very abstract subject. There's a whole course on Sunday, I think Sheila's doing the first meeting, which is going to go through the ABC of Marxist economics. So I'm not going to talk in detail about every bit of Capital, but I want to say a little bit about the first chapter, because it is such a challenge if you want to actually read the book. Essentially what Marx does in the first chapter is he talks about what he calls the twofold nature of the labour process. The labour process is what happens inside the capitalist workplace. And he says that the labour process is doing two things at once. First of all, it involves drawing together acts of what he calls concrete labour that go into producing particular commodities, particular use values, as he puts it. This book is a use value, this bottle of water is a use value, they all have their own particular use. But the labour process that goes into creating them is very specific and it's unique to that particular use value. There's a concrete process of labour that takes place. On the other hand, Marx argues, there's also what he calls an abstract labour process going on. And it's this process of abstract labour, labour in general, labour stripped of its own particular unique characteristics, that goes into producing value. And its value in a commodity, the value contained in any given commodity, whether it's a book or a bottle of water, that gives it this form of exchange value that allows commodities to exchange for one another on the market. Abstract labour is the one thing, one social property that all commodities have in common, and it allows them to be equated with each other and exchanged on the market. And this amount of value in a commodity, Marx argues, can be measured. And it's measured as a duration. It's measured as an amount in hours, in minutes, in seconds, in days of labour that's contained in a given commodity, the total amount of labour contained in a commodity. Now that's not to say that if I were to go away and produce a book or anything else, because I happen to be lazy or incompetent or a bad craftsperson, and it would take me infinitely longer to do any of these things, that the commodity I produced is more valuable. The other argument Marx makes in the first chapter is this whole process is regulated by what he calls the socially necessary labour time contained in commodities. So it's not how long the particular commodity takes, it's how long is required to produce it with the prevailing techniques, the forms of production, the machinery and so on. Already Marx is talking about the capitalist system as a totality that regulates this process of production by the pressure the different units of capital bring to bear on one another. So the whole process of production is regulated by the amount of socially necessary labour time contained in commodities. One other point which I'll just mention briefly is, of course, Marx is not just talking about the labour that goes into a commodity inside a workplace. He's talking about commodities as an accumulation of labour, what he calls living labour, put in by workers in the here and now, and dead labour in the form of machinery, raw materials and so on produced in the past, whose value passes into the final commodity. And the final commodity, whatever it is, contains in a congealed form this mass of living and dead labour that gives it its value. You can already see how revolutionary this is, because what Marx is putting at the centre of his analysis of production is the labour of working class people, the billions of working class people who actually labour in capitalism to produce stuff. Completely absent, by the way, from much of mainstream political economics today. Now, a version of the labour theory of value had already been discovered by Adam Smith and David Ricardo in different forms. I'm not going to talk in detail about that. But Marx is able to go beyond Smith and Ricardo with his labour theory of value. And in part, that's because of a very particular method that Marx adopts in Capital. And again, I want to say something about this method because it helps to steer people through the book if they understand something about this. Marx, and there's much more, by the way, if people want to understand this, they should read Alex Klinikos' book, Deciphering Capital. Talks much more about the method in Capital than I will. But Marx talks about his method as being a method of rising from the abstract to the concrete. What he means by this is that he begins by stripping away all those superfluous, confusing complexities of capitalism and looking at its simplest, most pure elements. So in the first chapter of Capital, he strips everything away and talks about value, abstract labour, very, very abstract concepts that he's considering in the first chapter of Capital. But Marx doesn't rest there. What he does, and it runs through the whole of the 3 volumes of Capital, is piece by piece, he adds back these complexities, these complicating features, and comes to a much more complicated, complex, concrete understanding of capital. But he does it through stages. And the argument is that when you get back to the complex surface appearance of capital, you can now explain these complexities on the basis of the abstractions. So there's a process where he rises from the abstract to the concrete. And one of the key examples comes about in chapter 6 of Capital. Again, so we're dealing with the opening section of Capital, where Marx poses a puzzle based on what he's revealed in the opening chapters. He says this: you have this world in which all these commodity producers are selling their goods in the market. How can anyone make a profit from this? Or, of course, you can see how an individual can make a profit by ripping off another individual on the market. Of course, you can sell a commodity above its price and so on and so forth. But in general, how do you make a profit out of this system? How does the system grow? How does it expand? And he writes this: the money owner must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption is therefore itself an objectification of labour and hence a creation of value. In other words, the key to this process is a sale and purchase of labour power. Labour power itself, the capacity to labour, becomes a commodity under capitalism. The working class have no choice, for reasons Marx describes in the book. Stripped of the land, stripped of the means of production, they have no choice but to sell their capacity to labour to a capitalist. And it's out of this process you can begin to understand the expansion of capital, the generation of profit. So here you see how Marx moves to a more concrete level, begins to introduce the question of the sale and purchase of labour power, and begins to solve this problem that he's posed for himself. How does this solve the problem of creating profit? We know from the first chapter of Capital, the amount of value created by labour is just the labour time that the labour works. A typical working day, a worker works 8 hours, 10 hours and so on. They create 8 or 10 hours worth of value on average. But Marx says, what's the value required to create this labour power? Simply the amount of value required to reproduce the worker, to get them back into work the next day. And typically this will be far less than the 8 or 10 hours worth of value that they can produce in a day. It'll be 4 hours worth, 5 hours worth. And to put it very, very simply, it's this gap between the amount of value created by labour in the working day and the amount of value that the worker has to receive in order to reproduce their labour in the form of the wage that explains all of the profit, or what Marx calls the surplus value, generated by the capitalist system. All of the profit generated by capitalism on a global scale comes then from the labour of 1.5 billion workers globally who labour under the system and are exploited by the system. And it's a central point, I would argue, in Volume 1 of Capital, that this process of exploitation, which lies behind profit generation, is not simply an act of fraud, not simply an act of robbery, not something that we can fix about the capitalist system, but is absolutely intrinsic to capitalist production. You can't have capitalist production without exploitation. And it means if you want to end exploitation, ultimately it means you have to end the capitalist system. It's a central insight that Marx has in Capital. Capital is dead labour, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labour, and lives the more it sucks. The more capital squeezes us, the more it enriches itself, the more it expands, the more it grows, and this becomes the life essence of capital. Okay. From this point in Capital, Marx begins to develop a much more concrete understanding of the capitalist workplace and how this process of production unfolds. And there's a whole number of chapters I'm not going to talk about in detail, dealing with cooperation, with division of labour, the introduction of machinery and so on. I just want to touch on one of the chapters because in some ways, if you want to dip into Capital before reading it seriously, it's a good chapter to read. It's a chapter on the working day. The chapter on the working day is fascinating to read, enjoyable to read, because it's a very concrete, it's a much more concrete analysis than the opening chapters. But one of the things that comes across very clearly in the chapter on the working day is Marx's identification with the working class. Because he says under capitalism, he's made clear that the question of how long people work is central, but he says this process of determining the working day is decided, among other things, by struggle between capital and labour. You get a sense both of the pressure on working class people. He gives incredibly vivid descriptions of, there's one where he talks about young people, 5 boys aged between 12 and 15 in Batley in West Yorkshire, who were kept working in the factory from 6 a.m. in the morning on Friday to 4 p.m. on Saturday with just an hour's sleep. And he describes the kind of conditions they labour under, pulling apart rags, woolen rags in a hole filled with dust. This chapter is filled with vivid descriptions of working class life in the early factories. But he also talks about struggle. And he talks about how working class people are impelled by this system to resist their exploitation. And this, together with divisions at the top of society in the capitalist class, help to determine and regulate the working day in capitalist society. It's a very, very good chapter to read because it's something that all working class people are deeply familiar with. Even in the contemporary workplace, there is pressure over the working day. Think about how the capitalist and contemporary society try to fill in every gap in the working day. How they try to do very, very petty things like monitoring how long people spend going to the toilet and so on, how long you spend on your lunch break, how there's pressure on people to eat your lunch at your desk if you work in an office and so on and so forth. It immediately speaks to working class people, and it helps to get a grip on why Marx is developing these very elaborate categories to understand the capitalist system. He goes on in the first volume to talk about the development of the division of labour. He talks about the role of machinery and technology, and again, he talks about both the way in which these developments, as they revolutionise the means of production, create a world of enormous exploitation, but they also create a world in which vast numbers of working class people are drawn together for the first time in urban centres, but are also drawn together in capitalist workplaces. Particularly in the chapter on machinery, he talks about how capitalism is a system that relies upon drawing together workers in huge concentrations in the early capitalist factories. Drawn together, oppressed and squeezed, but out of this process you begin to get resistance, struggle, and so on. He talks as well about the way in the early factories women and children are drawn into the workplace in huge, huge numbers. These kind of arguments fill the pages of Capital, particularly the middle third of the first volume of Capital. That's the first of the key social relations of capital Marx talks about, the process of exploitation in the capitalist workplace. I want to talk more briefly about a second social relation of capital that Marx describes in the 3 volumes of Capital. And it's something that lurks in the background in many of the discussions in Capital, and that's the question of competition. Because Marx describes capitalists somewhere as a band of hostile brothers. They're a band of hostile brothers in the sense they're brothers in that they're united in a desire to exploit and oppress the working class. But the capitalists are also divided between one another, hostile to one another, over dividing up the spoils of this process of exploitation. There are battles inside the ruling class, Marx argues, over who's going to benefit from this process of exploitation. And Marx struggles through the manuscripts of Capital with how to deal with the question of competition. If you read the very earliest plans for Capital, he talks about First of all, I'm going to deal with capital in general, and only when I've dealt with that will I come to discussing many capitals competing. Yeah, 10 minutes. Marx clearly feels a pressure as he writes Capital to more and more bring in the discussion of many capitals of competition into the earlier writing, because it's intrinsic to explaining why capital functions as it does. And I want to try and explain why that is. The basic reason for this is something Marx touches on very early, where he says that the capitalist becomes under capital a personification of capital. Capitalists don't just exploit people because they're unpleasant people, because they're confused about their priorities or anything like that. They exploit people essentially because they have no choice but to exploit people if they want to remain capitalists. If you're an ethical capitalist, you find very quickly you have to cease to be ethical or you cease to be a capitalist. You're driven out of business. You're locked into this frenzied battle of competition with other capitalists. But the battle of competition doesn't just mean exploitation. It also means something else that Marx talks about towards the end of the first volume of Capital. It means the accumulation of capital. It means taking some of this profit, squeezed out of working class people, and hurling it back into the process of production, using it to hire bigger, better, more machinery, more advanced technology, and revolutionising the means of production. And the central reason why capitalists have to revolutionise the means of production is because they're locked into a battle of competition, fought out, as Marx puts it, by cheapening commodities. And the way that you cheapen commodities, if I'm producing books or newspapers or bottles of water or whatever, how do I cheapen those commodities? I cheapen the commodities by making labour more productive. And the key way that I make labour more productive is I invest in more advanced technology. And you see this all the time under capitalism. Imagine printing newspapers. Imagine printing Socialist Worker using technology from 50 years ago. Actually, you don't have to imagine. The Socialist Worker print shop used to produce Socialist Worker using technology of half a century ago. Very rapidly we found we couldn't take on other jobs and print them profitably in the Socialist Worker print shop. We were eventually driven out of that market because there's more advanced capitalists who invest more of their surplus value and buy much more advanced technology. This process of competition, of accumulation, is intrinsic to the capitalist system, and it drives the system forwards. It has very important implications. Because it means that the capitalist system is out of control. It's not just out of control of workers. Marx talks very vividly about how workers lose control of this process. But for the capitalists as well, the system is out of control. They might be, as Marx writes somewhere, happy in their alienation, but they're alienated from the system. They don't control the system. The system it takes on a life of its own and drives forwards relentlessly, and anyone who gets left behind is driven to the wall. The capitalists are impelled forwards by the system. And it gives capitalism both an enormous dynamism. It's the most revolutionary mode of production ever seen, but it also makes it incredibly destructive. Anything that poses an obstacle to this process of accumulation has to be ripped apart and destroyed. Everything has to be torn down if it's a barrier to accumulation. And that has very important implications. Any socialist analysis of the environment has to start from this question of accumulation. We have to start from the destructive power of capitalism as it drives itself forwards. Okay. One other point I want to make briefly about Capital. I've only really talked about the first volume. There's more in Capital than is contained in the first volume. The first volume really deals with the question of production of value under capitalism. Second volume deals with circulation. I'm not going to talk about the second volume. The second volume is by far the most difficult to read because it's in places very, very tedious, very hard work. The third volume then draws together these two elements of circulation and production, and it talks about the system as a whole. And it's in the third volume of Capital that you get some of the most interesting bits of Capital, where Marx deals with the process of crisis under capitalism, and it deals also with the question of the financial system, the credit system, these very concrete aspects of the capitalist system. that in many ways provide a building block for the analysis of crisis today. First of all, if you look at the writing on crisis, what you get in the third volume of Capital is a picture of capitalism that doesn't simply accumulate, but as it accumulates, begins to put pressure on profitability, undermining its own profitability and beginning to choke off future accumulation. You begin to see in the third volume of Capital how the capitalist system is not just crisis prone, but it's self-limiting. The more it accumulates, the more it undermines its future accumulation by choking off profitability for reasons that will be discussed in the economics course on Sunday, and I'm not going to go into detail about. You see too the way in which Marx begins to explore in the third volume of Capital the way that the credit system, interest and banks and so on, push capital beyond its limits, allow the capitalist system to expand beyond its limits for a time, but then become, in Marx's phrase, a source of swindle and crisis. You want to understand the crisis of 2008, you have to understand both the decline in profitability over the long period running up to 2008, but you have to understand how the financial system gives the capitalist system new life, dynamism and so on, drives it forwards, and then the whole thing comes crashing down in a new way through a financial crisis. This writing provides the building blocks for the kind of analysis we have to do today. Okay. Final point. I've tried to briefly, I suppose, illustrate some of the basic points in Capital and give a taste of the kind of discussion Marx engages in. Let me just say very, very briefly a few words about the actual process of reading Capital. It's very, very tempting when you read Capital to treat it as a work of individual genius that we have to consume as isolated individuals. It's wrong on both counts. Of course, Marx was a genius. I'm not going to deny Marx was a genius. But it's also a collective work in a real sense, both in the narrow sense that lots of people are involved in writing Capital. Friedrich Engels is engaged in his correspondence, goes on for decades about Capital, has to edit 2 volumes of Capital, has to fork out money to support Marx whilst he's writing Capital, and so on and so forth. Marx's long-suffering wife, Jenny Marx, has to do the horrific job of trying to copy out Marx's handwriting and try to actually produce readable, legible copies of Capital. But more generally, it's a work that is filled up with the question of collective struggle, of the kind of debates taking place in the socialist movement, and this collective attempt to challenge and overcome Capital. In a real sense, a spirit of collectivism pervades Capital, however much it's a unique product of Marx's genius. So too with reading Capital. If you're planning to read Capital, and I hope you will go out and buy at least the first volume of Capital, and as I say, I have a wager that someone's going to buy all 3 volumes, so do buy all 3 volumes, but buy the first volume of Capital, read it, but don't think you have to read it on your own. Everyone who tries to read Capital struggles to read it the first time, struggles in particular with the opening chapters of Capital. Join a Capital reading group if you can. Even if you can't, read some of the introductory text. There's a little book I wrote a few years ago. There's a book by David Harvey, a companion to Capital. There's lots of books you can read that help to steer you through Capital. Come to meetings like this, but discuss it with people. If you come across something you don't understand, sit down with someone, talk about it, ask someone who's read Capital already, and go back to it, and read it again, and look at it again. Capital is a book that repays repeated study. I think there's bits of Capital I've read 4 or 5 times. I'm sure there's people in the room who've read it more times than that. You always find something new when you open up Capital. There's always something fresh, exciting that sheds new insight on capitalism today. Marx recognised this, and let me end with a quote. He wrote, dealing with the problems of reading Capital, he wrote this. He said, "There is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining the luminous summits." The summits of Capital are very luminous indeed. It's well worth the climb, and I would encourage you to go away and read it. Thank you.
Right, I'm just going to speak very naively from our experience of the last week. To me, it just seems for British capitalism, I'm quite sure, absolute madness to leave the EU. That capitalism, I believe, wants it. And yet, something that's a political crisis does seem to be having an effect on capitalism. So I'm wondering about what building tools we have from capital to understand what's going on around us at the moment.
I didn't need to do that, but after 2 minutes I'll touch on the microphones and enable a minute left. Yes, Matthew. Do you want me to
Yeah, please, thank you. Yeah.
go backwards, is that
Yeah, fine, thank you. Yeah, Chancellor Reason's clamshell more important economy. Clamshell less important economy said that. Think about that. More important economy, not life itself. Lots of conclusion, lots of more important profits, anything else, even life. Actually, just understand. Yeah, just think about that. Yeah.
Right. I suppose I've got a question or a problem about method, really, which is Joe's explanation about Marx's method. And I understand absolutely the method of start from the abstract and then go to the concrete and the particular. And I understand that's the strength, really, of the analysis that comes from Marx doing that in the opening chapter of Volume 1, and laying down those key principles and then going back to specifics to then develop from that. And I understand that he does that. What I'm not clear about is whether then what we're saying is that that's a method that we should then adopt. It seems to me precisely not, really, that in terms of the way we actually argue and convince people about the nature of capitalism is to start with the specifics and then to generalise from the specifics. So, we start with the question of life's just at work, when the boss is taking a tea break away, etc., etc., and then we have a conversation about that, and then raise, if you want, the way in which exploitation is taking place, whatever, that fits into a general pattern analysis of the way that capitalism works, really. So, are we saying that Marx's method is a sort of he uses that, if you want, to make this world historic intellectual breakthrough in terms of analysing capitalism, and therefore it's a sort of fundamentally important intellectual process he uses? Or are we saying it's a process that we should then ourselves adopt? Because I've got a slight problem with that if we're saying that it's a process that we should adopt. Because I think that does then lead you to the sort of the problem, the Harold Wilson problem, if you want, that people have, that you start with very, very abstract concepts and it's quite difficult to grasp those. So that's a sort of question I'd like you to perhaps respond to that.
Alex is next.
Okay, well, I want to respond to what Jane said, because I think we, I don't know whether we do, but we should try to use the method that Marx uses in Capital, because what's the point of the method? The point of the method is, in rising from the abstract to the concrete, the abstract aspects of the theory allow us to identify the essential features of capitalism, and then, as Marx introduces more and more concrete categories, then the complexities, the nuances of how capitalism works are built in, but built in a way that starts, that allows us to understand how they fit into the system overall. So, for example, Marx says finance markets, what we call financial markets, represent capitalism at its most fetishistic. In other words, seeing the economy as a meaningless process governed by objective laws. So in the financial markets, they talk about value creation. What that means is advancing a certain amount of money and through speculation making a profit on that. So it looks like money breeds itself. What Marx shows is if you start from production and the extraction of surplus value in production, then you can see how what the financial markets do is take some of that surplus value and the capitalists compete for that share of the surplus value. So the method is really important. And so the comrade asked about how can Marx help us understand Brexit and so on and so forth. There's a passage in Capital, volume 3, which I've quoted in the online version of International Socialism, where Marx says, paraphrasing, the state arises from the relations of exploitation, but it can react back on those relations. In other words, the state is shaped by the exploitive relations of capitalism, but it has a logic of its own that allows it to have an influence on the economy. That's what in essence, that's what we've seen. A crisis in the Tory party at the level of the state, of politics, that ultimately arises from the economy, then reacts back on the economy to create this crisis. The other thing that is worth saying is when it comes to getting people, when it comes to the way in to understanding the system, you don't have to start at the most abstract level. So of course, when we're talking to people about capitalism, we say, look at, the latest horror of Osborne or something like that. Marx, in correspondence with one reader, says, I know the beginning's quite difficult, so why don't you start with the final part, the part on primitive accumulation, which is about the very brutal process of expropriation, imperialism, slavery and so on, through which capitalism constitutes itself in the first place. And once you've got a sense of the nature of capitalism, then you can start on the difficult stuff. But you need abstraction, as Marx says, you need the power of abstraction as an analytical tool for understanding the essential structure of the system.
Hi, Claire Chandler, Walthamstow branch. I wanted to say two things. One is carrying on from this stream. First of all, when we're talking to people, ordinary people, about what the world's like, we do start with, yeah, it's shit at work. No one's saying we should start with the Labour theory of value when you're talking to a bloke that you're just talking to, that you've just met, who's down in the dumps. That's going to lose them. So you need both things. So you need to have an appreciation of theory and abstraction, as we've heard, but you also need to be able to relate to that person as they see the world. Bring them in with an increasing analysis and discussion of the world, and your position is enhanced by an appreciation of the abstraction. And there's a quote that I think I'm going to mangle here, which is basically, science wouldn't be necessary, I am paraphrasing. Science isn't necessary if the world was exactly as it seemed, and I've forgotten whose it is, what the actual quote is. So we need to be able to strip away extraneous detail, get down to the basic bones of the subject to be able to see what it actually is, and then generalise with people with their everyday experience. The second thing I want to talk about is being part of a capital reading group, because I never actually I thought it was a thing that I should do. I never appreciated that I would actually enjoy reading Capital. That was a shock. So please do go forth, buy your 3 volumes of Capital and enjoy yourself with that. Reading it in a group gives you a couple of advantages. First of all, you're shamed to keep reading because everybody else also will, so you may actually finish it. And the second one is you can discuss what you've got. So what I found is that someone else would pick up one particular point, someone else would pick up a point that someone else may have missed or not brought up to the level of importance that it should have. And bringing in that discussion really enriches the whole thing. And my final point about rereading it from people who've read it before, this is my first time through it, is that I've heard from people who are reading it the second and even the third time, is that you see Marx's method on subsequent readings, because the first time you're down in the what is he actually trying to say. The subsequent times you can see the dialectic, the actual Marxist method coming out. That apparently, I am told, is a joy.
You're next, yeah.
Yeah, very much following on from the last two contributions. Michael Gove, when he was when he was being interviewed about the Brexit campaign, said something very interesting. He said, people are fed up of being told what to think by experts, and I think what he meant by that was economists. Basically, economists were producing all these studies of how bad Brexit would be, and he's saying basically no one believes what economists will say. And I think that is a very good entry point, because economics isn't a science like climate science. Economics is sold to us as being something which is objective, but the economics which we are taught and which appears in newspapers, as Joseph has pointed out, isn't actually based on empirical evidence, and you cannot, the attempt to treat economics as a science like physics just doesn't stand up, because real sciences are based on empirical evidence, and economics isn't. My interest in reading Capital started after the financial crisis. Before that, I wasn't that interested in it. I think there's a very big interest in reading Capital. One of the things I've been also following is David Harvey's video series, which has got a lot of views. I know you need to be very careful simply accepting everything David Harvey says, but I think he's made a very accessible series, and I think it's quite useful. And one thing that I like about Capital is, I think, people were writing about its literary qualities. To me, Joseph talks about the vampire nature of capitalism. It is very much a sort of Gothic novel in many ways. Capital is the great Gothic novel. And I think, you can read on that with beautiful little... I think the footnotes actually are some of the best parts. And just one more point, and I think this is important. I think something I learned from David Harvey, maybe you could comment on that, is that when David Harvey talks about Marx's writings, he says you need to distinguish between the universal laws, the general laws, and he refers to capital as being about the general laws of capitalism, and the particular forms of capitalism. So we can talk about neoliberalism, we can talk about Stalinist economy, we can all say they're actually different forms of capitalism. And then he talks about the singular, and in the singular he talks about, Marx's historical writings, things like the Brumaire, Civil War in France, and other literary parts of history which are about individuals acting and what he calls the singular events. I wonder if you could comment on that, and whether you agree with that way of seeing Marx's writings.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Aisha from Edinburgh. I studied economics at university, and frankly it was very confusing and also brainwashing, so I completely agree with what Joseph said at the beginning about economics as a science and everything. But when I read Marx, it was enlightening, because in the first volume the most important thing I learned was the theory of surplus value, and how labour is a source of value, and how the system produces commodities, and the exploitation of the working class that's needed to produce those commodities and to create profit for the bosses, and how the system creates surplus through the working day and stuff like that, through extension or speeding things up and squeezing more out of workers, and this is a profit for the capitalist class, and how you get accumulation through that, and competition, and how you get bigger and bigger units of capital, and they become larger and larger, and eventually there's a crisis that's built in within the system, and that crisis can play itself out also politically. And I think the second point I wanted to say was, I think in the second volume, which I just started reading, the most important thing was that Marx talked about commodities and the circulation of money, and he uses a dialectical process, and it shows you how value is created in this process, and how hoarding of money exists, and how finance comes about. And I think that was really important too, because it helped me, give me the tools to criticise neoliberalism and monetarism and oppose it, and empowered me to be able to think independently and how to apply it.
Kim Wingfield from Lowestoft Branch. I wanted to thank Joseph for what I thought was a fantastic introduction. I wish somebody had given me that 50 years ago, but never. We can't wind the clock back. When I first began, I haven't read Capital for many, many years, donkey's years. But when I was young, I did sort of dive in. And I want to echo what people have said about, really do give it a go if you haven't, A, and B, do it with other people. Because if you're on your own, like I was, reading this stuff, and you sort of said, there's acres and acres of C, M, C prime, and you say, get on with it, we get it, And it goes on and on and on, and I didn't understand what the subtlety was. I just thought, well, would you ever get on with it? And then a few chapters later, you suddenly go into the upland of this, the comrade called it Gothic novel stuff, where he writes absolutely beautifully and so on. And some of his polemics, as you say in the footnotes, are marvellous, aren't they? It really gets going at people, But, okay, so I think if, and it's worth, and obviously you don't get it first time round, and obviously the rereading and so on, but it's a fantastic resource then. Because although it's a very long time, and I'm inclined to reread it now, having been inspired by the discussion here, but it's a resource that it's a kind of, you put it in the bank. I read on The Guardian the other day, and I followed the links, this chap writing in Foreign Affairs about what they're calling a secular stagnation, yes. I mean, and they're wittering away about, well, there isn't the investments and the savings rates and so on and so forth. This is pointing at, although nobody really seems to have the gall to say it, it's pointing at the declining rates of profit, all the stuff that we've been talking about in our theory and so on. And one last point, it's ideological. When Wilson, and before him Keynes, gets up and says, it's just a vulgar way of having a go at people who take things seriously. That they're, I tried to read Marx, but it's, no, it's all rubbish, don't you worry about that stuff and so on. It's an ideological intervention, and so therefore do read Marx if you haven't, and Capital in particular.
John, you're Irish, SWP. I've got a question, which actually our chair might want to answer as well as Joseph, or somebody else, other people may want to answer. But in the meeting last night on social reproduction theory, it was said that some people argue that domestic labour contributes to surplus value because it produces labour power. Labour in the home helps produce workers who go out and work, so it contributes to the production of surplus value in the society as a whole. Then it was argued that this was wrong because labour in the home was not producing commodities that are sold in the market, so you couldn't speak of the exploitation of domestic labour in that way. It was confused. Now this then raised in my mind two questions. One is, well, you could say that labour in the home produces a commodity, labour power, which is sold on the market, point one. And second point, if you say that, if you say that it doesn't produce a commodity and therefore is not exploited, and so on, what do you say then about, let's say, the labour of teachers or nurses, etc., who also don't produce commodities in the sense of physical things that are sold on the market? So I'd like to ask That's why I mentioned Sheila here, because I know she's worked on this, but I would like to ask, just generally the meeting as a whole, how do you think the question of domestic labour fits into Marx's theory of surplus value and exploitation?
After the comment here, it's John Carrington and then Richard.
It's a multiple choice question. What is capital? It's an easy one, this. Is it a thought or concept? Is it a thing? Is it a process? Or is it a force? Or all of the above?
Yeah, John Pynton, Oxford. I just want to make a point about the way in which capital and the method Marx used in Capital was an inspiration to scholars and scientists after the Russian Revolution in different spheres of economics, because I'm particularly interested in the science of the mind. Lev Vygotsky was an important Marxist who made major contributions to our understanding of how the human mind works. And it's interesting that he was very much compared to some of the people at the time who were trying to formulate a Marxist psychology by basically just taking existing psychologies and just tacking on a lot of quotations from Marx and Engels. Vygotsky specifically said that he wanted to create a psychology from the bottom up, not just by quotation. And he did this by looking to Capital, and he said one thing that's distinct about Capital, the way it's been written, is that Marx finds a unit of analysis, which is the theory of labour theory of value, and then he uses that to understand how everything from the economy as a whole right down to the individual kind of relations between workers and the bosses as individuals is affected by this unit of analysis. And obviously that's quite in contrast to the bourgeois method that will either just reduce things to the lowest common denominator or split. I mean, I work with colleagues at Oxford University, and I'll say, what do you think about the crisis? And they'll say, oh, well, I'm not a macroeconomist, I'm a microeconomist. So somehow you can sort of separate the two. But what was interesting in psychology was that because Vygotsky used this idea of a unit of analysis that would sort of penetrate everything from the macro to the micro scale, he was able to make some important steps forward. And I think it's important today. We want to understand how the human mind works, to say it's different to say an animal, that we use this kind of method, this dialectical method, because there is a tendency in science to just reduce things, reduce things to cells, molecules, that kind of thing. And I don't think you can really do that without also realising the human mind is different from an animal mind, because it's in a society, has these social relations, and we can only understand the micro level by having that understanding of how the macro and micro penetrate.
Martin at the back there, and then yourself there.
Richard from JCVP. I've got a question, I think, for Alex and Joseph, which I'd like him to come back on, which is on the Marxist method, which, in terms of economics, I agree with you. I think when you're selling socialist work, well, I do anyway, you get into a discussion with people, and in reality, I use the labour theory of value to start the process. So I say to people, okay, if every CEO and deputy CEO of every single corporation in the world stopped work for 2 weeks, would you notice? And the answer always is no. Right? If every worker in the world stopped work for 2 weeks, would you notice? And the answer is always yes. And that's the labour theory of value to me. That's what I'm using. But what concerns me is we just talk about economics or politics, because actually our party has a long tradition of we listen to the class. The Soviet was not invented by Lenin and Trotsky. It was invented by the Petrograd working class, and what the Bolsheviks did was generalise it. They were sort of the office for standards in revolutionary politics and said, look, this is good practice, people, this is what we have to do, right? And that's important that we don't lose. And I don't know if Alex and Joseph are arguing that we just always go from the abstract or not, because we have to learn from the class, and that's part of our tradition, that we listen to what is going on inside the class. And that's my question, really. Cheers.
Thanks, Richard.
Joseph mentioned in passing the question of environmental crisis and capitalism, and Marxist Capital has played an incredibly important role in the last 10, 15, 20 years for a whole number of writers and scholars in re-examining the role of capitalism in its relationship with the wider environment and its part inside nature. And in part that's been a reflection, I think, of a number of scholars trying to understand the way the system works. It's also actually because Marx gives an incredibly clear explanation of how the development of capitalism leads to what is called the metabolic rift between society under capitalism and the wider natural world. And I think what's interesting at the moment is that there's enormous debates developing and erupting inside or amongst those scholars and writers and activists who discuss these things around some of these very important questions. And I think one of the tendencies that's happened for some writers is to cherry pick some of the best, or what they see as the most important, the most relevant bits of Marx in Capital, and simply use them. And you see it a little bit with Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein doesn't claim to be a Marxist in any sense at all, but her only quote from Marx in her wonderful book on climate and capitalism is one of the bits where he talks about the rift between capitalism and nature. And there's, I think, a number of authors, Jason Moore, for instance, who in his recent books have started, I think, using just the bits of Marx at the end of Capital, where he talks about primitive accumulation, the separation of workers from the land and all that sort of stuff, to explain the origins of capitalism's peculiar question of the environment, and ignoring the rest of the stuff. And I think it leads them into some problems. So, for instance, some of the major debates now are really actually about the abstract stuff at the beginning, about the question of value, the simple question sometimes that can actually look quite stupid at first. Do animals create value? Because if they do, then animal labour in the peasantry is very important in terms of developing capital. Marx actually, I think, tackles some of this, and to refer obliquely to John Molyneux's point, by actually focusing very much on the question of exploitation under capitalism, and he doesn't neglect the role of that sort of labour and its importance in generating the next generation of workers. But he doesn't neglect, but he focuses very much on the exploitation. The reason that's important, to finish, Chair, is because actually if you abandon those or ignore that question of where the value comes from, you start to abandon the central role of the working class and actually the potential to end capitalism and change it, which is why you must always marry all sections of Marx's work together and not just focus and cherry pick simple bits of it.
Thank you, thanks. But just a last speaker made a point which I think says something interesting about whether there is much separation between animals and people, especially under capitalism. But I wanted to ask two particular things for comment, please. I've got a niece who just completed an economics degree at one of the North London universities. She got a 2-1. I told her about this thing going on here, invited her along. She said, "Who's Karl Marx?" So could you comment on that? And maybe perhaps I was flabbergasted. The other thing, sorry, I missed the beginning of this, unfortunately, so I wanted to ask, should Marx necessarily be read sequentially? I don't know if you answered that. If you did, apologies.
You mean Capital?
Sorry, yeah, Capital. I mean, yes. Sorry, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion and lots of questions as usual. Let me just come on to the 2 points the comrade made right at the end. Yeah, it's not very surprising at one level that someone who studied economics can ask who the hell is Karl Marx, but it's tragic. It's absolutely tragic. But it shows the extent to which, even compared to the classical political economy of Smith and Ricardo, mainstream economics has ripped away any kind of social, historical dimension and become more and more a branch of mathematics and more cut off from the real problems faced by capitalism. And this hasn't gone unnoticed by people studying economics. There's been a very interesting movement among young economists in America, but also increasingly in Britain and Europe, demanding to be taught what's called heterodox economics, Keynesianism and other forms of economics, but also Marxism. And alongside that, an explosion in capital reading groups that took place a few years ago, and still today, quite a lot of interest in Marx. So let's hope that over the coming years, that rebellion among young economists continues. Should you read Capital sequentially? If you want to properly study Marx and Capital, you do have to read the book cover to cover. Nonetheless, if you want to dip into it and get a flavour of Capital, do read the final chapter Alex mentioned, the chapter on the working day, the chapter on machinery and so on. Dip in, get a sense of what the book is like, and then go back and read it systematically from beginning to end. I think ultimately you do have to read it in order, because Marx ordered it that way for a particular reason, and it's again to do with his method. And I want to say a little bit more about the method in Capital. Claire mentioned the quote from Marx, where he says, I think the quote is, "Science would be superfluous if appearance and essence coincided." In other words, capitalism has a bewildering, perplexing, incomprehensible surface appearance. You look at the world today, this is true in spades. I mean, you look at the world in which there are now negative interest rates in banks, central banks across half of the globe. It's perplexing. I mean, when I was a child, I tried to get my parents to explain interest. You put your money in your bank and they give you more money. Doesn't make any sense to me. That was positive interest rates. Negative interest rates, you put your money in the bank and they take money away from you. It makes even less sense. Why would anyone put that money? The surface appearance of capitalism is perplexing. So it's not just perplexing because it's complicated, though. Marx argues it's inherently perplexing because of a process he describes as the fetishism of commodities. A process in which, as he puts it, the social relations between people, the relationships between us as we produce stuff, the stuff that we need to consume and so on, these relationships between human beings take on, in Marx's word, the fantastical form of relationships between things. And as this process unfolds, the capitalist system takes on this fragmentary, perplexing, almost eternal, impenetrable surface appearance, in which it seems to operate as almost a blind force of nature. Again and again you hear people talking about the bond markets. The bond markets want this. The bond markets want that. The bond markets won't tolerate this. We can't reduce austerity because the bond market won't. Who are the bond markets? Bond markets aren't a living, breathing human being. There are people behind these social relations. But for us, it seems like it's this automatic, natural system driving us towards disaster again and again. So that perplexing surface appearance is a product of how capitalism itself is structured. We have to penetrate below it, but we also have to have a method for understanding how that system works, and that's the method of rising from the abstract to the concrete that people have talked about. Now, do I agree? I think it was John Sinner who asked about Harvey's comments about Marx distinguishing between the general, the particular, and the singular, I think it is. And so he says that Marx confines himself to talking about the sphere of law-like generalities in Capital. I don't agree with that for some very slightly complicated reasons, but to put it very simply, I think that there's an extent to which Marx starts off with that kind of approach, but as he writes Capital, that approach breaks down. And what Marx is forced to do is integrate the particular and the singular into the universality of capital. So when Harvey talks about the particular and singular, he's talking about capitalist competition, he's talking about credit markets and so on. These things are integrated into the analysis precisely for his method of rising from the abstract to the concrete. Of course, many of these features only appear in the third volume of Capital, but essentially all these things that Marx tries to integrate into the analysis of capitalism. So I don't agree with Harvey's account in that sense. Someone asked quite close to the beginning, is it true that we always then apply this method? Now, if someone comes up to you when you're selling Socialist Worker and asks you about, well, what do you say about all this Brexit stuff and so on, you don't then start by saying, well, you know, the wealth of all societies in which the mode of capitalism predominates appears as you don't start with chapter 1 of Capital. You don't do that. You don't start by talking about value, abstract labour and so on. Of course that would be the wrong approach in terms of those discussions. You start from the very specific crisis that we're in and you generalise from that. That's true. But if you want to push forward Marxist theory in a serious way, you have to follow this kind of method, in my view. And that applies in a whole number of areas. You look at the work that the party has done over the question of imperialism over the years. It follows a very, very similar method. The work that I'm trying to do around class at the moment What's the method? I went back to Capital and I followed the same kind of method of rising from the abstract to the concrete. You look at the work that Martin Empson and other people are doing on the environment, it has the same kind of method that we're trying to apply. And to answer Richard Milner's question, that method of rising from the abstract to the concrete doesn't leave out of the question the role of working class people. You see, one of the interesting things about Capital is the extent to which Marx learns from the class. Even in the process of rising from the abstract, he's drawing on the lived experience of working class people and their struggles. The chapter on the working day is a case in point, because what Marx is doing is trying to concretise these arguments about value by talking about how the working day is fixed, but he talks about it as part of a struggle between workers and bosses. And he draws on the experience of those struggles and integrates it into the account more and more as you rise from the abstract to the concrete. So I don't think that's a superfluous issue. I think it's intrinsic to the whole method that Marx adopts in Capital and we have to adopt today. A couple of other points. John Molyneux's question about domestic labour, I mean, it deserves a whole meeting, really. Let me just say a few things briefly. The first thing is that there's lots of forms of activity that don't generate surplus value because they're not subsumed under the capital-labour relationship, and I would include domestic labour in that category. That's not to say that domestic labour can't be oppressive, part of a system of oppression in which women tend to be pushed into those roles. And it doesn't mean that it's not important to the capitalist system. There's lots of forms of activity that are important to capitalism that aren't directly subsumed under the capital-labour relationship. But it also means that there's a tension in capitalism, which Lisa Vogel talks about in her book, between the needs of capital to expel women from the workforce in the late 19th century in order to secure the reproduction of the family, and on the other hand, the attempt to draw women back into the workforce in order to boost the amount of surplus value you generate. And these two contradictory pressures play out in the historical development of women's labour throughout the 150 years and more since Marx wrote on political economy. Today, I would say we're in a phase in which more and more women are drawn into the workforce. And it's precisely as they're drawn into the workforce, they begin to realise the capacity to overcome their oppression. So yes, being drawn into the workforce means that you're exploited, but it also means you secure a collective power as part of the working class that you can then use to break down oppression and exploitation. To answer the other bit of your question, are teachers, nurses and so on exploited? They don't generate value and so on. Depends what you mean by exploitation. If you're a teacher working in the public sector, you don't receive a wage that reflects the length of time that you work. You receive a wage that simply reflects the amount of value you need to reproduce your labour power. If you're a teacher, therefore, your conditions of employment are no different, really, from those that exist inside the private sector. In that sense, you can say that people don't receive the full fruits of their labour. But in terms of generating surplus value, no, you're not exploited. You don't actually create value that then is seized by people inside the capitalist class. So it depends what you mean by exploitation. But certainly those groups inside the public sector are part of a wider working class whose conditions of existence are determined by the wider working class and whose struggles will have an impact on the wider working class movement. So in that sense, we should understand those people as part of the proletariat. Okay, two final points to sum up. Someone asked, what does this mean about the crisis that we're experiencing today? I think it's very much wrapped up with the crisis today. I mean, when I was writing stuff on the European Union, of course I go back to the kind of analysis that Marx has in Capital, because one of the points that Marx makes in Capital is that capital is restless. It spreads over the globe and increasingly spills across national barriers. But the other point that Marx makes is that capital becomes concentrated. And as it becomes concentrated, it gets locked into particular states, and these states clash on a global scale. And what you have in the European Union is a product of European capitalism to overcome this contradiction by creating a single market across the whole of Europe. I won't say much more about the analysis, because there are lots of other meetings about the European Union and Marxism, but if we want to understand the European project and the crisis it's in today, why it's such a bad crisis for the ruling class, we have to go back to Capital. Very last point. Someone said, what is capital? Is it a thing? Is it an idea? And so on. Capital is a social relation. That's what Marx argues in his writing. It's a social relation that involves value that's ultimately pumped out of workers being set in motion in order to expand and generate new value. That's what capital is. It's the very life essence of capitalism, and it's what it does. Our job as socialists is to understand how capitalism and capital does that, but also ultimately to break down this social relationship and this process of exploitation and accumulation and build a world based around meeting human needs and not a mad scrabble for profits. Thank you.